Enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.
Welcome to And Good Company. I'm Sarah Fiedelholtz. We all know a great dinner party isn't really about the food. It's about the people seated around the table engaging in lively discussions. And Good Company gives you a seat at the table to enjoy great and smart conversations as they happen. I am very pleased to be in the company of Anne-Marie Labenberg, who is the Chief Equity Officer and co-founder of Stream. Welcome.
Thank you. Welcome. Thanks for having me.
So before we really get into Stream and what it is and how it does it, I wanted to talk a little bit about your background and how you sort of got to doing this work. And just for a summary, we'll get into it, but Stream is really about looking at bias and how that decision-making influences our outcomes, in a sense. So just to clarify that, so what we're looking at is understanding bias. Mm-hmm. But tell me a little bit about your background and your involvement in research and education and how you got to where you are, so we can talk about Stream.
Sure. So I started off really early in my life having a few sentinel events that transpired where I realized that people make really horrible decisions about other people based on very limited views or understanding of other individuals. And so having those moments happen when I was little, I knew I didn't ever want to make those types of decisions. I didn't want to make those kinds of overarching decisions about other people. And so in that, I became incredibly curious about why people make decisions. It seems like most people have the idea that I'm consciously thinking about everything that I'm about to do, and I have planned out all of the pieces, and that all the words that are going to come out of my mouth and the decisions I'm going to make about people, that I'm 100% in control of that. And unfortunately, research has shown that you have like a 3 to 4 second delay between the time you make a decision and when you become consciously aware of it. And the more I researched that, the more that I looked into this, and I started looking at the patterns that happen in multiple different industries. But my passion has always been in the medical community, so that's where my original set of things worked out was I became a nurse and I owned a home health agency, and then I saw the way that people made decisions about who they wanted to have coming into their house, who the people wanted to take care of, which companies would take which types of patients, who would take payer, all of those things. And I realized that there was something much bigger at play here. And then I became aware of a lot of the research that was done by a neurobiologist, Sam Harris. And so I became kind of obsessed with understanding how did he get to this point? How did he understand these things? And then I read his book, Free Will. And it talks about the illusion of free will and the fact that you are 100% alert and oriented and aware of the reason why you make every decision. It's an illusion that most of us come with, but we've all done things or seen things over time where we go, gosh, why did I say that? Or why did I do that? We've all done that.
Or why did I send this email? Or
right. And so those are the big pieces where we kind of talk about how do you ultimately understand why you make the decisions that you do, and really what's the root cause? Because most of the research, you know, when I went through that, it was like you're being bombarded with like 11 million pieces of information
in the course of a day.
Well, yeah, and so then,
but how many do we actually focus on? You said was like 40, right?
And so the idea behind this, I was like, well, that just seems like a recipe for disaster, right? Like if those are the only ones you're focusing on. And then I thought about it. I was like, well, have you ever driven somewhere and you do not remember that drive? 100%. It's because you knew the patterns that got you to where you needed to go, plus muscle memory and all kinds of other things, but you don't have to think about what a stop sign means. Now, do I want a 16-year-old making the drive? No, like that's why there's more accidents. It's where they don't have that patterning.
Well, but also, you know, a 16-year-old also doesn't have that frontal lobe development. So, I mean, what you're talking about when you talk about how people make decisions and stuff is we're really talking about the brain and how the brain works, and there is some of that evolution and biology of the brain, and then what we can influence of the brain. So, but if you were a nurse and in the healthcare field, how did you get interested then? I know that you said you were a lifelong learner, so were you interested in looking at research and data analysis and to answer the question of why?
Well, and one of the things I became obsessed with is why were outcomes different for different groups of people. So that was one of the things, like, what are we missing in the course of, like, why is there a disparity between, or really an inequity? Disparity assumes that you can make a difference about it. If we get to a point where it's consistently the same, what's different? And so then I've always been a research article reader. I mean, I tend to read between 60 and 75 articles a month that I'm going through, sometimes more if I'm working on a project, obviously. And so I was going through and I'm like, I keep seeing the same kinds of patterns that were happening. And I even knew from my nursing school education that there were inaccuracies that were given, which formulate some of the ideas that we go through in there. And I was like, but wait, that's not true.
Right.
And so there's assumptions that we make. Healthcare's full of assumptions,
we
right?
make assumptions, we have perceptions, but there's lots of aspects of this type of research about how and why we make decisions. Like some people, they're going to look at the neurotransmitters. Some people are going to look at behavior and habit forming and, things like that, or, changing the way people do things. But you decided to focus really on looking at bias. Now, how did you go from why and how people make decisions to saying, when you did your research, to saying, what I see is similar, or where I feel is this underlying, is this idea of bias? So before you tell me why, the first thing I want you to do is I want you to define what is bias. And I know there are different types of bias, so let's just do with a general of what is bias.
We'll do the 35,000 foot view. So bias is essentially having a preference for one thing over another.
Okay, and is it determining how you got that bias as well, or just starts from the fact we all have biases and they're just there and
they just are?
Okay.
And that's one of the biggest problems in the perception of bias, is that people want to assign good, bad, evil, positive. They just are.
Like they want to do racist, anti-racist, they want to do,
And that's actually one of the biggest problems that I've seen when people look at training, is because I call it IST training. So everybody walks out and figures out what kind of an IST you are, right? Like, I'm a racist, I'm a sexist, but that's not the point. Actually, what bias you have is actually immaterial to understanding that you have that bias and what that has to do with the decisions that you make.
And some biases actually are good to have, because they could, in certain careers and things, you want people to have certain biases or approaches to things.
Correct, and it's really just about patterns and scripts. Like, people want to make bias this, like, big, hairy, ugly thing. Back in the olden days, when something rustled to the left of you, you needed to recognize that meant you needed to go right. Or your genetic tree did not go on because you got eaten by whatever happened.
Well, that's that whole fright, flight, that's genetic code. And then, but the idea of also, when you look at bias, and I look at what Maya Angelou said, if they knew better, they would do better. So partly what you're also saying is, because we don't realize that we just make decisions and we think we really are forming them, but we don't know. And then really understanding how we make the decisions we do, and maybe what we need to do in order to stop ourselves or not continue that pattern. I mean, it's sort of like the idea of, what Albert Einstein said, the true definition of insanity is keep doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results.
Absolutely.
Okay, so you in, was it 2018 that you and the Jack Patton, right, who is your co-founder, that you got together?
We actually didn't connect up until 2019, and it really started, he was in a mastermind that I was running, and his look at behavior change and how people make decisions, I was like, wait a second, that's the kind of stuff that I've been doing work on, because I've done implicit bias training for over 13
and he
years
actually was
now.
in marketing. I mean, he was trying to understand how, really, in the sense of how to manipulate people's decisions to get them to do or buy what you want them to do, which is truly what the media, I mean, advertising and marketing, in a sense, is supposed to do. So now let's talk about before, okay, so we got the definition of bias.
Right.
Now you just mentioned implicit bias. Okay, so there's lots of different types of bias. So implicit bias means what?
So it's the unconscious decision-making apparatus by which you make decisions about things, but you're not consciously aware of them.
Okay.
And so that's the thing between an implicit and an explicit bias. You can have a preference for white people over black people, and that doesn't mean you are a racist.
Right.
It just means that you have a preference. It's a pattern.
Right, because
and so those things are they're very different. That's the problem. People want to assign is names to biases, and that's not actually what that means.
Because ultimately, wouldn't you say that what makes you a racist is actually how you allow your biases to influence or impact what you ultimately do?
And it's consciously making the decision.
Right.
It's that this is my bias and I'm going to act on it, and I'm consciously going to act on it. That literally is the difference between the two. Implicit biases are silent influencers.
Right, and we talked about that, and some of them we're not even aware of because, again,
most people aren't aware
because,
of.
again, all of this goes back to really understanding the structure and working of the brain. Because if, like we were talking about, if you look at how you develop language, it's really through hearing it and, you know, and someone talking to you and listening to other people. And so it's really about those patterns and repetition, and you learn what you're around. So
you acquire it. That's the thing with your first language. You acquire it. So if there's what we would consider racist phrases that you learned from your parents, you don't understand why that's the phrase. You may not even understand the history behind it. Heck, your parents may not even understand the history behind why they say something like that. But you acquire those terms and phrases and thought processes because that's what you grew up around.
It's sort of like when I interviewed Pastor Erdos, and I was saying to him, well, how does someone decide to become Lutheran? And you know, and he really said, well, a lot of your religion choices are really what your family did. And then obviously as you go to college, that's when everybody throws everything out the window and is going to question everything. And that probably is also the time when probably, you know, also that frontal lobe is more developed, and that's when everybody's examining their biases and all of that. But again, it's really just because that's the environment that you had. So, okay, so now we understand that you were going to, you wanted to look at implicit bias, and you wanted to really have a way to truly measure it, as well as to measure if you create programs to help people think about it or change their behavior towards it, that you could really measure the outcomes.
Absolutely.
So that's where STREAM comes in, right?
Yep.
Okay. So you met Jack, and then he was looking at how to sort of manipulate.
Well,
or
he was
not
really looking at how business owners and that could understand the decisions that they're making from a behavior change standpoint. What's motivation? Where do people want to go with that? And it sounds really far apart, right? Like talking about stuff from the idea that one is really like looking at the science of behavioral sciences, which is what he's looking at, and this is looking at like decision making. And
but again, it all comes back to what is between our ears.
Absolutely.
It's all about the brain, and some of the things that the brain does we have control over, and some we don't. And we don't want to have control over some things, like we don't have to think about to breathe. We don't have to think to blink our eyes, to keep our heart pumping, you know. We don't have to every second think, okay, pump, you know. Those things are good. So, and that's sort of to think about also how people make, in a sense, their decisions, is that is the exact same way. You just don't think about it. So one of the things that you talked about was the idea that we make lots of decisions. How many decisions did you say we make in the course of a day?
Oh gosh, it's a lot.
Okay.
I mean, we're making many decisions.
Okay, so what I
wanted
to ask you was, what in the course of you coming here this morning, what were some of the decisions you made that people wouldn't think, like is that really a decision, or where you think also a bias could come in, just to give me a sense of where, or where I'm just not even thinking that I'm making a decision, but I actually was making a decision in your own personal experience this morning.
So, and there's a ton of them that happen. Like if you're aware of and know to look for things,
right,
you start seeing things in a completely different manner. That's been one of the things that for me, I question why I make decisions. So, but one very specific one, I had somebody who cut me off on my way driving down Lima Road to come here. And that split second thing where you make the mental connection that you're like, oh, I assume it's a insert whatever the hyperbolic relationship we have with the women drivers,
right,
or old people or whatever.
Right.
Like,
or if it's a certain kind of car, or if it's a new car versus an old car, or if there's certain bumper stickers on it.
Exactly. And so in that moment, like I am aware of that I need to question why, and I had 2 kids in the car with me.
Okay.
So if I'm going to say that and I continuously say something, then that's something that they're learning as a pattern as well. So knowing that that's the kind of overarching thing that we get trained on. Like, remember, we're trained every day by news, by what we watch on social media, or the movies, the magazine. We're trained to think certain ways all the time.
Well, because they know, like, I mean, it used to be that in order for a brand or something to register, you had to see it 7 times. Now it's like 21. And so they know, I mean, they know sort of how, again, it's all about the brain. They know how to sort of, based on how it works, to sort of create things, or how many times they need to run an ad, or they need to do things. But there's also the idea also with, when you talk about with the kids in the car, or how you do certain things, there's also that cause, effect, and reward. I mean, our brain is very much about based on a reward structure, right? And also that if we get proof. So like if you knew that the way you drove to work every day gets you there safely, and and so you're not going to deviate from that, because you know that every day you've done it, and it takes you and gets you. Now if there was something jarring that happened to you, like you got into an accident or something on that, you may, next time you may decide you got to create a different path, because there was something consequential that took you out of it. But in the most part, it's sort of habitual, and we get rewarded, and then our brain is sort of gets fed sort of that reward system, and then we go on to the next one. So when you look at the really bias and this implicit bias, so using stream, what was it that you really wanted to understand about bias and how it with the idea of how we make decisions?
Well, I think one of the biggest things that really caught my eye was the idea that we might not be able to get rid of a bias. We keep getting bombarded with the same messages, but that we could actually pause long enough to make our brain catch up with that decision, long enough for us to question, why did we make that decision? That's one of the very first things that we use in Stream, is that once you know what your bias is, that's for you to know. We don't tell anybody else what your bias is. Heck, we don't even know what it is. But what we do know is that if you don't understand the historical, social, and societal background behind why that bias exists, it's really hard for you to be encouraged to understand, what do I need to do that I have to check myself, that gives me an opportunity to have some way to manage it. And that was the big part we were looking for, was a way to hold people, accountability, everybody hates that word. Accountability is a tough one for a lot of people, but holding people accountable for something where they have a bad feeling about it.
I would say it's more to make you aware, and more to bring it to your conscious level.
Well, we do that, but we also wanted a way to make sure people were applying the tools that they were using. And so the idea was, it's not just enough. Like, how many times have you sat through a training and you sat there for 4 hours, and then 3 days later, if I asked you 4 questions about it, you couldn't answer it?
Well, that was the whole, so let's just look at, so everything basically that you've done to build Stream was really based on research related to that. So there is the idea of what's didactic learning versus progressive learning. And didactic learning is really when we sit in a room for 8 hours. First of all, the average person's attention span, truly engaged in a half hour, is about 7 minutes. And then you've got, if you said, like you said, with didactic learning, 4 days later, how much does someone really remember? And okay, so let's just, so with Stream, and I did it when you were doing the test of building it. So the idea of it is, it's an app, and you can do it on your phone or computer or desktop. Okay, and there's 16 areas that a bias, right, or that you're testing.
Yes.
And so basically, let's just take the one that was about the idea of integrated health, okay, which was looking at your biases towards disability, age, sexuality, religion, or one that stuck out to me was about weight. Okay, so basically, you use your hands and you read 2 statements, and then you say which one you more likely agree with. So it could be that on one it would say overweight people are stupid, and then on the other side it would say overweight people are not stupid, right? And then you have to push a button with whichever one. Okay, and there's a whole series of these, and you do them in a very specific order, and there's a whole method to your madness. But at the end of the day, and there's, for each of these areas, there could be one for ageism, there could be one for looking at how you perceive religion, how you receive education level, it could be race, all kinds of things. And then based on the reaction times, I guess, or which one you react to, that's what you're measuring. And from that, you are able to give a very objective that you may have a bias towards
and it's
this.
really that you have a preference.
A preference, okay.
And so the idea is that you are faster at associating one word, phrase, or picture with either good or bad types of things. And so that gives you an idea. If you're faster at associating A with B than you are C with D, then you have an idea of which one you have a preference. So that's ultimately what it is.
And then I, of course, tested you on that, because I was like, well, but sometimes I forgot which one, and I got startled, and I don't know, and you actually said no, built into, and what amazed me about when I talked to you about it is how much research and science and data has been built into doing this kind of research. And we're talking about, this isn't just from you, I mean, you really used an open source from Harvard, you looked at the other professors, I mean, and all the studies that have been done across the board to sort of give you that data to be able to analyze what my reaction time was. And so you actually told me, no, that's taken into account, and they actually only measure certain answers. And so this is really, truly science. And we have taken out, even though it is sort of perception and association, which people would say is more not necessarily quantifiable, you have really figured out how to make this quantifiable in terms. Okay, so I do go through, and I tried to look up today what my scores were, but I think it's no longer. I don't remember my password or something, but I couldn't really tell. But so anyway, so then okay, so now I found out that so I have a bias, which is about. I'm just going to say I have a personal bias. This is not true or not, but about people being overweight. Okay, so this is a implicit bias. So then what? Okay, so now we know that, and then what is Stream going to do with that information, and how does it help me understand that bias and think about it? So what's the next step?
So the next step is, so the first thing is to learn about your bias.
So I got this bias.
So you have that part. Then very next step is to learn about the cultural, societal,
so
and
like
those
people will say, okay, so I'm going to stick to this one. So people will say it's the images from the media. We see with the Victoria's Secret models, they got rid of their show. It could be who's on TV. It could be, I believe, and I actually did this as a undergraduate, I actually believe with associations of weight and appearance, it actually starts in children's books when you read them stories, because the witch, the bad person, the evil person, they're always fat, slovenly, they look, all disgruntled. So it really, and again, if you keep hearing it, you start, and then also, in this case, it's also could be what your mother, or how your parents associated with it. Okay, so we look at this historical context of it, and we now understand that, okay, yep, I've sucked into, all the media and what my, mother has told me, if you're not thin, you're not going to get a man, all that kind of stuff, and you're not going to be pretty, and all the values of that. All right, so we sort of lay that out as to, because also what you're trying to say is that although this bias is implicit, I didn't just have it. Like there were things that influenced me to create this bias in the first place.
Absolutely.
So that's why it can't be good or bad, because in some ways it happened to me.
It just is, and that's exactly what it is. Your biases happen to you.
Right. I don't have control over it.
You don't choose them. You don't have access to whether or not you're going to have them. No. And the reason why most people get a little bit salty when they look at the results is because there's cognitive dissonance. I may not actively think that way about other people, or I may not think that I actively think about people that way. But if you're pressed to make split-second decisions, you're under pressure, you do not have the luxury of time, that's when those evolutionary parts take over that look at patterns and scripts to make decisions. You force me to make a decision in a moment when I'm upset or I'm doing something, that's when you say things you didn't mean. That's what you probably did mean them. Right. But not in a conscious manner. And so therefore, those are the kinds of things that are in there. And there's a reason why we do them in a specific order, because I firmly believe, and the research shows, if you do not understand the stories you tell about yourself, you're not going to have a clue about the stories about other people.
And so now I'm going to push back about this whole thing of bias, because I also believe that if you have the emotional quotient, or you're more in tuned or self-aware, or done introspective work about yourself and the stories that you tell yourself, I think that would make you more aware of potential biases.
Well, if you've never looked at it, though, there's a lot of different. So the idea is that if you have a higher EQ, you're going to be able to understand your biases and be more likely to look towards them. The real issue,
and again, what you also did is because if I do it, it's more of the, it's more the stories, it's the anecdotes. That's not measurable. So if you look at it more the way you're measuring it, that's really quantifiable and measurable. So it's really taking out the sort of the nebulous of the stories I tell myself to really sort of see what are the stories I'm telling myself.
And that's really where most people, that's why we do them in that order, because most people are like, well, I don't have low self, because we look at self-esteem as one of them. And I'm like, I don't have self-esteem. Self-esteem doesn't have to do that I think I'm awesome. It has to do I regard myself as being willing and able to exist in this world.
It's like, it's placing the value. Like for a lot of women, it's the idea, and this again, I'm going to use my weight thing, has to do with their being willing to take up space. And if you're so obsessed with weight and everything, you want to take up as little amount of space as possible. But in terms of your interaction with the world, or your engagement, let's say having to be the surgeon or in the ER, and you're the person who's, person's on the table, and you've got to make that split decision, you've got to be able to fill the space. And so it is things like that. So we figured out my bias, and then we give me this historical, sort of preference and how to think about it. And then what you want to do is say, you're not trying to change my bias.
Nope.
What you're trying to then through, and I think what's so interesting is that you really are taking on the trend of micro-learning, which is this whole idea now that little like snack bites, or people can do it on their phone. It only takes like 10 minutes a day, and they're showing that again with all this didactic learning and how that we only really pay attention for 7 minutes, that this is actually a very effective way to learn and engage. So you're really utilizing the capabilities of technology, again, with more research of how our brains work, to create a program that sort of helps you build this habit of stopping for a second. Like it's sort of like when you write that really irate email, and you wish on the computer there was the take back or the pause button, or something comes up on the screen. I always wish there was something that would come up on my screen and says, "Do you really want to send this email?" Because then that gives you that split second sort of stop. So really, what you're sort of doing is helping to create that. Do you really want to make that decision. And you have to do it very quickly.
Right.
Because you can't, if you've got someone on the table, it's a life or death situation. Although most of our decisions, not necessarily life and death.
Not like that, but it does turn into, like, we've all heard of road rage and all those things where if we just step back, why am I angry?
Right.
We could probably come up with the correct solution, the more humanitarian version of events.
Right.
But we live in instant gratification, making those quick decisions, and people like to, shoot from the hip, right?
Right.
The idea behind it is that if you're effective at making decisions and you want to reduce the effect that your individual biases have, you have to learn to pause. 3 seconds is probably
so
not
we all
going
should
to
get,
change.
you know, you remember like when there was the Kinko's commercial that had that red little
press the button.
The press the button. So we all need to have a pause button like everywhere. Okay, so the idea is pausing, and then but you're also again I can't stress enough how impressed I was that this is, and I'm the first to play devil's advocate when I think that it's not based on research. There's no sound science. Everything that is done with this stream is absolutely, it is validated and researched and based on cognitive data that we have. So the idea is also that you also are trying to get me to form a habit of pressing that pause button. So the other issue that has to come up is it used to be that we could form a habit, like if we wanted to go to the gym every day or we wanted to not eat, you know, like for me, if I don't eat chocolate one day, then I won't eat it. But if I eat chocolate one day, then I'm going to want it the next day. I just got to make it through one day without eating the chocolate. So it used to be 21 days. If you did something for 21 days, you could form a habit. Now, it's like 6 weeks. So that's why people stop doing things. That's why people stop going to the gym. It's why they stop, you know, quitting smoking, because habits, first of all, are hard to break. They're hard to create. And the time frame it takes you to shape that habit is 6 weeks. So you've sort of designed this program and how you do it and watching the videos, and you also keep very much journaling of keeping track of what you've done, and you know, asking, did you pause that button today, or did you ask yourself why you made that decision, and really track it. So what I want to talk about though is you gave me a really perfect example of how this works and who's it for. So I want you to tell the story about the IT department, because this is a perfect example of what people would never think that our biases would impact, you know, because most people think it's more about how do you treat people, or how you think about African Americans, or how you, you know, are you more likely to be friends with somebody? But this was really very tangible in the workplace. So tell that story.
Yeah, so we worked and took an entire IT department. So when you think IT departments, they're incredibly diverse. You have people from all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of areas.
And they are absolutely more right brain. They are very limited in their scope of what they want to do. They're also very limited in some of their communication skills. You know, they're not necessarily, they do a lot of things that's very independent work. Okay, so because we got to set the type of people there.
Absolutely,
okay.
And very introverted.
Right.
So adding another layer of difficulty in communication into people is the social setting.
Right.
Well, they had another division that was coming in, and they really
They were merging
two
IT departments.
divisions.
Right. Okay.
And so when they were coming together, this seemed like a perfect time to figure out, like, this is everything. We have brand new people, brand new things, people coming from different backgrounds, different experiences,
different cultures.
Absolutely. And from 2 different organizational setups.
Right.
So everything was different in their world. So the vice president of the division said, we're going to add this into the mix here because I really want to see how everybody's interacting.
So they purchased, because we want to make it that you are for profit.
Yes.
So they purchased Stream, and basically they really buy memberships for the app. So it's not like anybody has to go anywhere. You don't have to go to classes. So okay, and then they all had to do it. Right.
Right.
And so first of all, that didn't go over too well, right?
No. Every one of the little sessions where we were onboarding everybody, I got pretty much lampooned during the entirety of all of the stuff there, is that mostly they were not very happy to be doing this because of all the reasons you said. They're very task oriented. This isn't going to help me get through my stuff faster.
It's a little more touchy-feely.
It's stuff that you're trying to make me change my brain. I was like, no, it's just a process to understand more about you. I mean, ultimately, that's what this is.
Right.
It's to understand more about you, and not in the metaphysical idea of getting to know you.
Mindfulness or meditation.
Right.
I mean,
it's not that way. It's really just understanding why you do what you do.
It's understanding your behavior.
And so the idea behind it is that if you have a behavior that you are not a huge fan of, this is a way to understand why you're having that. But if you have a behavior that you are not particularly a fan of, you are more likely to consciously want to change that. But this, with Stream and with these departments, these are not behaviors. They don't think there's anything wrong. They don't. They absolutely
They all think that they're doing perfect and that they all know what they're doing and they do their job well, and these are the top IT people. They know how to code, whatever it is. They're like, and they have proof because they are very project task oriented and they are getting it done. So they're like, what are you talking about? There's no problems here. So then what happened?
So then they went through the whole entire process.
Which was 6 weeks.
Yes. Well, theirs was actually 8 weeks. At that point, theirs was just longer because of onboarding. But when they went through the process
and they do this on their own pace, right?
Yes. And
there's no group think, or we don't all sit around a table and say, what did you learn? And so this is all more self-reflective and internal.
Right. Okay. And we do offer reflection sessions so that if somebody wants to kind of talk about what they learned or the things that they had.
When I was when I got my bias and I was like, I don't know, I wanted to talk to someone about this. So yeah.
Right. So we offer that as an option as part of that. But when he came back, he was like, who are these people? The first time he went into the meeting, he's like, I can literally see the wheels turning in their head. Like they're thinking before they're speaking. They're getting projects done because they're better communicators.
Well, you said that they're getting projects done more efficiently, using less time. What were some of the other tangible outcomes of this? So were they better at communicating with each other?
And that was the biggest thing that he saw, was that change in the communication. Because even with the team that was already there and insular and they'd already been together, they were different. How they communicated, how they handed off projects when things had different people working on it. He said it was completely different. And even to this day, when we follow up, it's still there.
Right, and that's the other thing that you talk about, just like habits, you need reinforcement, you need to check in. It's like I was telling you that every year, there's 2 things that I always do every year. I always reread Strunk and White, The Elements of Style, which is all about the basis of grammar. And it's the only audiobook I do. I always listen to Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, just to check in, to remind myself of the habits and what I should be thinking about. So you also build into this that there is refreshers, and you got to check in, and it's a habit and it's a muscle, and if you don't keep using it, you're going to fall back to your old ways. So, and again, you based all of this on science of how our brains work. So, okay, so what other fields, or because mostly you have 2 really you're looking at doing this in companies and organizations so that they can function better, they have better all those touchy-feely team and people, feeling
and
good.
Engagement and recruitment and retention.
So one of the things that you also talked about, which I don't know if I got right or wrong, is the idea that people who have more biases are less engaged. Is that what
it's
was
not
that?
So it's the biggest part of it isn't that the people who understand that they have biases and understand them have less issues because they are more engaged with their employer, because then they're not making decisions based on, I'm assuming that my colleague who's older can't help me with this project because I assume that they don't know anything about technology. When in fact, because this is a real scenario that happened.
Well, it's the whole thing why there's ageism.
There was an individual that did our program, and that was in their reflection was, I have purposely not asked my older colleague when I've had technology-related issues, come to find out, like, he is like the subject matter expert, and I could have been doing it, but I chose to struggle or to ask
Right.
other colleagues instead of asking him because I assumed.
Right. Well, that's that. That was from the Bad News Bears movie. Don't assume. It makes a ASS out of you and me, and that's the fundamentals of journalism. You do not assume anything because, again, that also falls into what I talk about, which is perception.
Yes.
And perception, there is a difference between perception and bias. Again, I think that perceptions is what you've gotten, what happens, and how you develop your thinking, and then they turn into these biases because you get reinforcement or rewarded for your perceptions.
Yes.
And so that's how, and then really what it all is that it's the difference between what's happening to you and then what you do for it.
Right.
And so you also were talking about really key fields or industries where this type of work is critically important. So let's look at the field that you were in, where we're coming full circle back to healthcare. Let's talk about that and what you found there and what you've seen based on some of the work that you've done with some of the people in healthcare.
So one of the biggest things that we've talked about this, I am a big fan of finding people who are the subject matter expert because they've already done the field and we've done that. So the subject matter expert on implicit bias in the emergency department is one of our advisors. Yes. So he has done tons of research and he went through, that was part of my thing, is that I need to make sure that this meets the clinical standards as much as it meets the ability for people 6th grade reading level and above to be able to do that.
The assessment.
Correct.
And the ability to do the assessment, you also had to make sure that what you are measuring and how you created it really would be able to have impact on certain fields in more of a general way.
Right. And so in the healthcare field, we have nurses and doctors and other medical professionals along the spectrum there, and we're taught patterning, and we're taught specific outcomes, and we're taught patterns of how we perceive care, who needs what kind of care, and we've made really bad decisions over time, and the idea that we always will do what we've always done because that's what we've always done.
So here's a perfect example of one. The idea that when some African Americans come to the ER and they say they're in pain, the assessment a lot of times is made that they're really addicted to opioids or whatever, and they just need a fix. So they're less likely to really assess them or really listen and really find out what the issues are. Or the other one that if they are, especially if they are an African American or Black woman who is low socioeconomic, maybe is overweight, not well educated, and she's pregnant. And that we make a lot of decisions, which also you can see is the result of maternal and infant mortality is so much greater with African American women. So that would be all of these things that really these split-second decisions that they do. Or so then you're aware that you make these biases, and then you go through the training and we all should have a pause button. I think
and there's lots of other tools we teach people as well.
And you have lots of other tools and they're not just, like there are other things you could do or like journal or check in with yourself. But I like the idea that we all should just have a thing that comes up. Do you really want to do this?
Yes.
So then with the research you found and then with Stream, with people in the healthcare, what were some of the outcomes that you saw?
So communication, in the healthcare realm, for those people who are unaware of how reimbursement works, there's these things called HCAP scores. And they're a series of different markers by which they're basically patient satisfaction scores. But some of the biggest pieces of those and the parts that count the most towards things that you have control over during the course of that is patient communication. And so one of the big things that research has shown is that the way that we fundamentally even start a patient history, the questions we ask, the assumptions about people's ability to afford care, the assumptions about what they can and can't do, cause individuals, based on that assumption alone, to make different choices for different people. It's to the point where we assume that everybody, if you're hemoglobin is low and you've lost a lot of blood, that we're going to do the blood transfusion. And we have certain, during medical school or nursing school, you're taught certain religions will not do that. And so we just don't even offer it based on that, or we offer it based on the idea that this is what we should be doing, without fundamentally understanding there's lots of other people who will not do a blood transfusion, and that the conversation needs to be.
A lot of people who aren't, they're not, they don't like gay people, because they'll think, oh, that blood could be, from
and that was a big, from 80s, 90s, that was a huge
that they were
idea that it created an assumption about people simply based on their sexuality. Again, that's the problem. We make decisions based on things that we associate with a particular. Generally speaking, for a lot of them are physical identifiers, so that people that appear to be female looking or male looking, or all those things. We make those assumptions.
And they can be very subtle, because it could even be how someone speaks, even if they have an accent or not. And
those are the kinds of things. I look at things like Serena Williams. I'll use her as the example, the yardstick, right? A woman in top physical condition who had already had a blood clot, who had already gone through treatment, who has the best trainers, the best nutritionists, the best team, the best staff, the best everything, and still nearly had at least morbid consequences,
because
if not
of
mortality.
Her pregnancy, because the doctors were not necessarily listening to her, in part, even though she's Serena Williams, because she was an African American woman.
And they were just going, this is what the typical thing is, so I'm sure it's this. And we miss lots of things because in healthcare, we're taught the pattern. Like, if this happens and this happens and this happens, it's this. If it looks like, it smells like, it walks like, then it is.
Well, that's why I always love, in the New York Times Magazine, they have the thing where you get to play doctor, where they give you all of the, they give you the background, and they tell you the symptoms and everything, and then they give you, you get to decide what the person had, and then they tell you really, and sometimes what someone picked up on or missed, and I mean, I love doing that, because you really see it, and then and again, those are the types of exercise where you really see your own bias, because you'll be like, oh, well, based on this, and they live in an old apartment, oh, that they probably live, it's lead poisoning, and then they really show you what it is. So again, it's also what I like about a lot of these things, and I think with Stream, is that in a very nice way, it challenges you to, and it's not judging. It's just challenging you to think a little bit differently, just so that may make all the difference. And so another area that this is really important, let's look at, is educators.
Yes, and so there's tons of research. The Kirwan Institute out of Ohio State has like an entire series of research projects that have been devoted to K-12 and then higher education as well, looking at how a series of biases that start very early in an individual's educational career haunt them. Because we just assume things at this very low level of education, the elementary school, when you have people who are multiple times more likely to go to a principal's office if they are black versus if they're white. And so then that starts this thing where they then get basically blacklisted, because that information just keeps going.
Well, they talk about on your permanent record. So if one teacher says, oh, he's a troublemaker, so when the next teacher gets her class list and she gets the files and she starts to read them, she's like, oh, okay, I got to keep an eye on him. And then that also, what happens is, actually it's not blacklisted in education, it's called redshirting. So what they actually do is, oh, then this kid, and that's how you get pigeonholed into that they need special needs, or that they're difficult, or they, whatever it is. And that, it's like this permanent record that follows you through, and that you don't even know what's in your permanent record, although your parents have the rights to review it. So you don't even know what you're up against.
And it's really a ripple effect. And in education, it's a very large pond. So you're starting with that little drop in the thing, but it ripples out into everything, because then it's like you don't get selected to be on the debate team because you have these disciplinary things.
Or the teacher's not going to recommend you because even if it's not true, she already has decided, so she, even in her own mind, because some of what we do with when we have an idea or something is, again, we want the reward that we're right. So what we will do is we will make it right. So she will just pick on that kid who is even trouble, even if he's like, instead of like, so if he's not talking to the person next to him, maybe he's fidgeting. So she's going to be like, sit up straight. You know, where's your pencil? What are you doing? Because she, in her mind, she has to make it fit, like put him in that box that he's a troublemaker. So there's also that kind of, you know, bias where we're even trying to keep our, what we're going to defend to the end, whatever our perception or bias is, and that, like you were saying, is that we don't teach people how to say they were wrong.
Yes, that is the biggest problem. I tell everybody, working in bias and understanding any of that is a progress over perfection event every day of the week.
Okay, let's talk about this again. It's all about progress, not perfection.
Right. You're not going to be perfect. No. You're not. You are going to mess up.
Right.
You are going to make bad decisions. You are going to hurt other people. You are going. This is going to happen.
But we have to learn how to say I'm sorry and admit that we were wrong. Right. Right, and admit that we were wrong.
Correct. I was wrong.
But we're so afraid. Like, if you're a doctor, you can't admit that you did something wrong because then you're going to get sued. And, you know, it's all about the litigious society.
And realistically, I think we have an overperception of the litigiousness of the medical community.
More people would respect, more people would respect in anything if they had just, you'd say to them, because sometimes, like, if somebody's unhappy about something I've done, I will say to them, what is it that I can do so that you will be happy? Most of the time, they don't want me to do anything. They just want me to listen and acknowledge that you're absolutely right. That was not handled appropriately, and reiterate to them that I've heard them and that I understand that they feel. Because a lot of times when you have somebody who's very irate, if you just say to them, I understand, tell me what I can do, they'll just stop and they'll get all flustered because nobody's asked them, and it's not really because they've thought about that end result. It's just what they want, the process.
They want to be heard.
Right, exactly.
Well, and I, you know, just from a personal example, looking at the medical field, I had an anesthesiologist during when my youngest was born, and I was like, look, my blood pressure goes really low during surgery, so you're probably going to want to front load me with some fluid so that we don't have this problem, or at least be able to give it. And he's like, no, like, yeah,
I got this. I've been an anesthesiologist. I know, yeah.
Your blood pressure's supposed to be low during surgery, blah, blah, blah. And so come to the surgery, we're not even 5 minutes into it, and I'm, you know,
your blood pressure drops.
I'm ill, my blood pressure is stupid low, and all these things happen. And this is the difference. He came to me after the C-section was done and I'm in recovery, and he's like, I have to apologize to you. When I was in medical school, they told us if you listen to your patient long enough, they'll tell you everything you need to know. And I didn't listen to you at all because I felt like I knew better. And he goes, this will go with me for the rest of my career, because he said, this could have had bad consequences. Luckily it didn't. But he's like, you told me exactly what I needed to know, but I assume that I know more than you.
That assume.
But I assume that I knew more than you. And he's like, I have to genuinely apologize. That was wrong.
And then you also helped him have an experience that would change and maybe get him to stop and think.
But if he hadn't said he was sorry, if he didn't agree to the idea that that was in there,
you would have been mad. You would have been like, I told him, and why is he jeopardizing my life, and he is incompetent, and then you're going to want to talk to the head of the department. I mean, it just fosters, because you also, but it goes back again to what do we want in our brain? We want to be heard. We want to be valued. We want to be, people meet us where we are. We want to be appreciated. So, I mean, you know, it does, and there's that ripple effect of how, but again, that's why I think people really, if you just really admit it, you know, and that's why I think we all get so aggravated with customer service, because you're like, they put you on hold, and then and then they can't help you, and then it just perpetuates to
Well,
it.
and it's also because we don't give people autonomy to make decisions, and I think that's really just this is just my little soapbox moment on this one, but we don't give people the opportunity to fail forward. Because if you fail, you're going to learn. You're never going to make that mistake again.
Like the doctor.
But we don't allow individuals to make mistakes.
Well, we don't empower them.
Right, and that's what I'm saying. It's the autonomy. So you know why the customer service thing is such a disaster? Because we don't give them the authority to make a decision.
Right.
People could de-escalate a situation, and I don't care what it is. Insert any industry. You could de-escalate things if you give people the authority and the autonomy to make decisions in the moment, knowing that they might make a bad choice sometime.
But that's like Nordstrom's, where they will just take back anything for any reason because that's what they value, is that the customer is right, or that, or the idea that having a person answer the phone and just immediately, because people going through you've already escalated how they feel and their emotions. So it's sort of those kinds of things. But it's also this idea of, but we're built on a society where failure is bad. You could if you do something wrong or do something, you could be fired. You could lose, you could not be promoted. So people have more tendency, they don't want to do things right, so they maybe not take a risk, or they may not question or stand up and say, maybe we should do this differently, because because we're in a society where, and also we're in a society where I think also with the biases, what it helps you with is we can't all be leaders. We also need good followers. And so, but we teach everybody to be leaders, but we don't teach, like with the IT, how to come together as a group, and not everybody is a leader. And you need the great followers, and so it is that, like, we don't emphasize or teach those kinds of things, which again are habits and how we train people. So I mean, I just think that, and this is really what I think so much about when we look at bias and behavior and habits, is that you have to look at everything holistically. You cannot just say, okay, we're going to focus on bias, but then you've got to look at all these other things, how they grew up, and where their education level and their religion and how they interact with people and what they do.
And that's actually one of the very first things that people go through when they do stream, is we look at bias origins. When did you find out that people were different from you? How did your family talk about people were different? When was the first time you met somebody that was different from you? Understanding that most people don't think about that, like when was the first time that you met somebody different? Unless there was some sort of sentinel event that happened related to that. You don't remember those things. That's one of the, implicit bias is kind of like the root cause, right? It's the very first basic, fundamental, you don't have control over it from the standpoint that you don't get to choose it. You don't have any idea that you have it until you've actually looked at the material. And that gives people like a firm foundation. The idea is that if we can assume that we're not going to be perfect.
That's a good assumption.
So if we can do that assumption that we're not going to be perfect.
And we're going to make mistakes.
And that means I'm not going to be perfect, and neither are you or anybody else. That's one of the things I think that we miss.
And you're going to make mistakes, and you're going to be wrong.
And the idea isn't that it's not that it's okay to repeatedly make mistakes, because then it's not a mistake. The first time's a mistake. Sometimes the second time might be pattern, like you're learning. But the third time and beyond, that's a conscious choice. And that's part of what it is. I really think that this gives people the opportunity to own their decisions.
And it's internal. I mean, it's all, so it's not something you have to share, and it's really just for you, but also to own your decisions and sometimes admit, you're not going to be right.
Owning them is good and bad. I mean, and I really think that bias, decisions, all of those things, one might not be the best decision for that person, that moment, that thing, that whatever. Again, it's progress.
And it's also fluidity, because it can change over age. As your brain develops, it can change by experience, knowledge.
I see my kids that I can come back and I know I'm hearing their teacher. Like, it's not my kids telling me this, and they're older, right? Like, I have kids that just graduated high school. I'll hear their teacher coming out, and I'll be like, where did that come from? And so it's an assumption that they make because it's the thing, a person in authority told me this, so therefore this must be the truth. And that's part of where I'm looking at bias is so important, because it's not about good and bad.
No.
It is. And so the idea behind it is if we can take just that moment to go, why am I making this decision? And look at all of the things around it. And I'm not talking about why did I choose Skittles versus M&Ms. I'm talking, which there's associations that go along with that one too. But if we just sit down and look and go, you know, why am I making this decision? Is it because I'm angry? Did I have a bad day? Is it because I have a bias that relates to the person I'm communicating with? Is it that I've had a bad experience before with an individual, organization, or something like that? Because that's how these things, when we talk about maternal mortality, it's an additive effect. It's not one. The same thing, part of what we do at the very end of the STREAM program is look at microaggressions, team dynamics, communication, because that flavors all of those things in all the decisions that you make. And if you don't understand that it's not just one thing, it's the layers that got you to there. If you were only exposed to something once, you're probably not going to develop a bias. It's a lifelong learning
it's a repetitive,
type of thing.
constant, continual.
And it's the stories. They're
it's
just
the
stories.
It's the narrative. So speaking of ends, and this you are not allowed to pause or say, why am I making this decision? Because at the end of each And Good Company program, I ask guests the same 12 questions that French novelist Marcel Proust popularized from a Victorian parlor game. And he believed that based on your answers, it does give you more of a sense of who you are internally. So you are not allowed to press pause and say, I got to think about this. Okay. What is your favorite word?
Progress.
What is your least favorite word?
Now.
What turns you on creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Intellectual ability.
What turns you off creatively, spiritually, or emotionally?
Style over substance.
What sound or noise do you love?
My kids laughing.
What sound or noise do you hate?
My dog's barking.
What profession other than your own would you like to attempt?
Oh, anything in neurobiology.
What profession would you not like to do?
I would not want to be a police officer.
What do you consider your greatest achievement?
Raising 3 kids.
Who, living or dead, would you most like to have a conversation with?
Sam Harris.
And he is?
The author of Free Will.
Free Will. How would you like to die?
Peacefully in my sleep.
And if heaven exists, what would you like to hear God say when you arrive at the pearly gates?
Finally.
Well, I want to thank you. I think you really just touched the surface. And as you get more into this and we start to really look at some of the different processes of thinking about bias and making decisions, I hope you come back so we can continue this conversation.
Awesome, thank you.
And you can learn more about And Good Company and all the other great conversations we have had at andgoodcompany.info. And we look forward to next week when you can again enjoy a seat at the table for great conversation and good company.